Few horror films have managed to carve their identity into the collective mindset of movie and specifically horror film fans quite like Saw. What began as a small, independent project between two school friends from Australia would go on to redefine an entire subgenre of horror. When James Wan and Leigh Whannell first envisioned Saw, they didn't have the resources to create something grand or cinematic in scale, but what they did have was an idea so sharp and unnerving that it thrived on its own confinement. The film wasn't about spectacle or elaborate effects, it was about tension, moral panic, and the horrifying simplicity of human choice. Long before it became a sprawling franchise filled with intricate traps and timelines, Saw was just a chamber piece, a psychological test wrapped in grime, mystery, and dread. It asked not just what you would do to survive, but how much of yourself would you sacrifice to do it? And in that question, it found something more terrifying than any monster ever could. At its heart, Saw was never purely about the blood or the shock factor, despite what its sequels and imitators would later amplify. It was about control, consequence, and morality under extreme pressure. The first film takes place mostly within a single room, two men chained by their ankles, a corpse lying motionless on the floor between them, and a cryptic voice commanding their actions through an old cassette recorder. That's it. No external cutaways, no monsters lurking in the dark, just two separate people forced to confront both each other and themselves. The simplicity of this setup is deceptive. Every second drips with uncertainty. Every silence feels like a scream just waiting to erupt. By relying on limited space and a handful of props, the film traps both its characters and, by extension, the audience inside a shared nightmare, one that unfolds slowly, methodically, and without mercy. The brilliance of Saw lies in its understanding that horror isn't always about what you see, it's about what your mind fills in. With its grainy visuals, feverish editing, and low lighting, the movie has created a sense of disorientation that mirrors the confusion of its characters. The audience therefore becomes a participant, scanning for clues, questioning motives, and dreading what might come next. There's an intimacy to the fear in Saw, one that feels tactile and psychological rather than explosive. Every sound of a chain rattling, every drop of blood hitting the floor, every desperate breath adds to a growing sense of inevitability. The film doesn't rely on special effects or jump scares to create horror, it builds it organically, through silence, through waiting, and through the suffocating weight of time itself. And when that final twist hits, it recontextualizes everything, turning that simplicity into something hauntingly brilliant. Saw's genius, and perhaps its lasting legacy, is how it turned its limitations into strengths. Born from necessity, it used minimalism as a weapon, crafting a story that thrives precisely because it had so little to work with. In doing so, it proved that horror doesn't need to be loud, sprawling, or expensive to be unforgettable. It only needs to be honest in its fear. By blending moral philosophy with raw, human desperation, Saw managed to strip horror back to its bones. Not a spectacle of monsters or hauntings, but a reflection of the darkest parts of ourselves. It's a film that took a single room, a simple premise, and a desperate question, and turned them into a legacy. Saw didn't just turn simplicity into horror, it turned it into art, reminding the world that true terror often comes from what's real, what's human, and what's left unseen. Hey, if you like what you see, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that noti bell because it really helps out. When Saw first traps its characters inside that grimy, decaying bathroom, it immediately redefines what the confined space in horror could be. This wasn't just a backdrop for fear, it was the fear. The room itself becomes a living, breathing entity, one that feeds on discomfort, confusion, and dread. There are no windows to look through, no doors that open to freedom, no moments of relief, only the sound of dripping water, the echo of metal chains, and the oppressive stillness of decay. Every wall feels closer than the last, every shot tightening the noose around both the characters and the viewer. It is a cinematic masterclass, how to weaponize environments, turning limitation into atmosphere. In the absence of movement or escape, the horror has managed to become internal. It festers in the mind, crawling under the skin until the viewer feels as trapped as the people on screen. What makes this single location so effective is how it transforms within the story. At first glance, it's merely a dirty abandoned restroom, but as the minutes crawl by, it begins to shift, not physically, but psychologically. The stillness becomes unbearable. The shadows start to feel like threats. Even the corpse lying in the center of the room begins to command a silent, dreadful authority. The camera lingers, not on spectacle, but on detail. The rustling tiles, the flickering of lights, the grime that coats every single surface you can see. Each close-up serves as a reminder that escape isn't just unlikely, it's impossible. The characters aren't simply imprisoned by chains, they are imprisoned by the design itself. Every inch of the space feels intentional, as though the room was constructed specifically to dismantle their sanity, and in a sense, it was. This deliberate confinement also forces the audience to confront something rare in modern horror, the discomfort of stillness. Saw doesn't allow its viewers to look away or catch their breath, but instead it holds them hostage alongside the characters, feeding on their curiosity and fear in equal measure. The pacing is slow, methodical, even cruel, but that's the point. By limiting its geography, the film magnifies its emotional range. When every corner of the room has already been seen, the tension has nowhere left to go but inward, towards paranoia, desperation, and guilt. The more time the characters spend inside the bathroom, the more the illusion of logic crumbles. They begin to turn on each other, to misremember, to doubt themselves. And through this slow unraveling, Saw reveals that the true terror of confinement isn't physical at all, it's psychological. By the time the film reaches its devastating conclusion, that small, colorless room has become one of the most iconic spaces in horror cinema. It stands as proof that creativity thrives under pressure, and that fear doesn't need sprawling landscapes or supernatural beings to become unforgettable. All it takes is a room, a few desperate souls, and the truth they can't bear to face. Saw turned its confinement into a narrative propulsion. Every inch of that bathroom was a stage for human fragility, morality, and madness. What began as a slow and low-budget necessity transformed into a storytelling revolution. Through simplicity and space, James Wan and Leigh Whannell didn't just build a setting, they built a psychological trap. And once you're inside, there's no escaping it, even long after the movie itself has come to a close. At its core, Saw is a film about morality disguised as a horror story because beneath the blood, grime, and torment lies an ethical experiment designed to expose what people are capable of when stripped of comfort, safety, and illusion. Jigsaw's traps aren't random, they are tailored punishments, moral crucibles forcing participants to confront their own hypocrisy, guilt, or apathy. Each victim is given a choice, one that seems both impossible and cruelly fair. The terror doesn't come from merely the threat of death, but from the awareness that survival demands a kind of spiritual disfigurement. You can live, but not as the same person. This moral tension, the unbearable pressure between instinct and ethics, is where Saw transcended shock value. It used pain not just as horror, but as a metaphor. The film dared to ask whether human beings deserve the lives they take for granted and how far they will go to keep them. The psychology of Saw's horror is rooted in confrontation. Each character is forced to face an aspect of themselves that they have hidden from the world: addiction, betrayal, selfishness, neglect, and to literally cut through it to survive. This isn't a horror that comes from an external monster, it comes from being forced to see yourself clearly. The traps Jigsaw designs function as physical manifestations of one's guilt. They are grotesque mirrors reflecting the flaws the victims have tried to ignore. The true genius lies in how the film makes the audience complicit in this very process. We do not just watch the characters suffer, we silently judge them, debate their worth, and measure their morality against our very own. We ask ourselves, would I do that? Could I live with myself if I did? In those silent dialogues, Saw became an exercise in empathy and revulsion, a horror experience that lingers not because of what we saw, but because of what we felt. The moral dimension Saw gives us is a unique philosophical kind of weight. Jigsaw, for all his monstrosity, sees himself not as a killer, but as a teacher, a judge who forces others to rediscover the value of life through suffering. It's a twisted, rather perverse ideology, but one that carries an uncomfortable resonance. By removing the randomness of death and replacing it with deliberate moral consequences, Saw forces its audience to question justice itself. Is Jigsaw truly evil, or is he merely revealing the rot already present inside of his victims' souls? The brilliance of the film is not that it doesn't give you an answer, instead it lets the unease simmer. You leave the story not with closure, but with contamination, a gnawing uncertainty about what separates punishment from cruelty, righteousness from sadism. And that moral ambiguity is far more disturbing than any torture device could ever become. Ultimately, Saw endures not because of its gore that the later films would expend upon to ridiculous amounts, but because of its original ideas. It speaks to something timeless and primal, the struggle between survival and conscience, the question of what it means to deserve life. The film's horror is psychological in its truest sense. It operates inside the mind long after the credits fade. By reducing horror to human decisions, choices made in desperation under the weight of judgment, Saw forces us to see that the real terror isn't dying, but living with what we've done to survive. The genius of its moral horror is that it implicates everyone, both victim and viewer alike. In Jigsaw's world, there are no innocents, only those who have yet to be tested, and perhaps that is the most horrifying realization of all. When Saw first hit theaters in 2004, 21 years ago, it wasn't supposed to change the face of horror. It was a film made on a shoestring budget, shot in a matter of weeks, and born out of the creative desperation of two filmmakers with more ambition than resources. Yet, against all odds, it became a phenomenon, not through luck, but through the sheer force of vision. James Wan and Leigh Whannell didn't just make a horror film, they made a statement about what horror could become when stripped of corporate polish and narrative safety. Its independent DNA bled through every frame, raw, unrefined, and brimming with intensity. The success of Saw was proof that innovation thrives in limitation. Its grainy aesthetic, frantic pacing, and psychological storytelling resonated with an audience hungry for something authentic, something that didn't talk down to them, but instead trapped them in the same moral nightmare as its characters. The release of Saw marked a turning point not just for horror, but for filmmaking as a whole. It revitalized the genre during a period where mainstream horror had become predictable and sanitized. The early 2000s were saturated with remakes and ghost stories that relied more on jump scares than tension. Then Saw arrived, grim, grounded, and deeply personal and psychological. It didn't need CGI or elaborate effects. Its horror was built from fear, guilt, and the unbearable intimacy of watching people destroy themselves to survive. That creative minimalism became a movement. In the wake of Saw's success, studios and aspiring filmmakers alike realized that horror didn't require millions, it required an idea that hurt. Films like the later Paranormal Activity, The Collector, and Hostel would all follow in its footsteps in one way or another, each exploring their own versions of confined, experiential horror. But Saw remained the blueprint, the film that turned a single location into a global conversation about fear and one's own morality. What's often overlooked is just how meticulously balanced Saw's artistry and accessibility was. It was experimental, but not alienating, cerebral, but also visceral. It made its audience think while making them squirm, offering layers of subtext beneath its surface brutality. And perhaps, most importantly, it reintroduced horror as a legitimate form of storytelling, not just spectacle. Critics and viewers alike debated its messages. Was it exploitation or expression, cruelty or commentary? The discourse was the point. By making audiences uncomfortable not only with what they saw, but with what they thought about it, Saw redefined what it meant for horror to be meaningful. It made dread intellectual again, bridging the gap between art house psychological horror and mainstream blood-soaked entertainment. It wasn't just a film to be watched, it was a film that tested empathy, endurance, and moral clarity. a film that audiences kept returning to willingly. As the sequels grew and the lore expanded to an almost confusing point, the Saw franchise evolved into something far larger than its original vision, a cultural event, a ritual of annual anxiety that dominated October cinemas for years. Yet even as the traps became grander and the mythology denser and more elaborate, the shadow of that original bathroom remained. It was the reminder that in all of it, for every twisted piece of the puzzle, began with two men in a room and a question that could destroy them. That simplicity became a mythos. Saw ushered in a new horror era, not because of its brutality, but because of its bravery, the courage to be quiet, to be patient, to trust its fear. In an age where horror had become predictable, Saw proved that innovation is born from isolation, and that sometimes the scariest thing you can show an audience is the truth they've been avoiding. Saw thusly endures, not merely as a film or a franchise, but as a paradigm shift in the language of horror. Its genius lies in transforming the simplest of premises, two people trapped in a room by choice, into a deep psychological crucible that lingers long after the screen goes dark. The movie demonstrated that terror doesn't require supernatural forces or grandiose set pieces. It requires precision, moral weight, and an unflinching willingness to confront the audience with uncomfortable truths about human nature. By blending claustrophobic tension with ethical dilemmas, James Wan and Leigh crafted a blueprint for horror that is at once intellectual, visceral, and deeply personal, proving that the most effective fear of all is rooted not in one's spectacle, but in one's choice. The influence of Saw reverberates through the genre to this day, shaping how filmmakers decide to approach confinement, morality, and psychological intensity. It reminded the world that horror could be elegant in its minimalism, powerful in its restraint, and profound in its exploration of humanity under pressure. From its indie origins to its cultural omnipresence, Saw turned limitations into art, simplicity into dread, and narrative economy into enduring terror. Ultimately, it redefined what modern horror could achieve, a mirror reflecting not just fear, but the darkest corners of the self, challenging viewers to question, to recoil, and to survive, both alongside its characters and within the shadow of their own self-conscience.
Track of my love.